afternoon, and welcome to the Ending Deaths from Despair webinar series. I'm your MC, Carla Gaines. I'm the co-chair of the African American Opioid Coalition of Safe Communities. And I am pleased to convene this webinar series. To our knowledge, it is one of a kind in the nation. So on behalf of the Dane County executives, Ending Deaths from Despair Task Force, we thank you for joining us and for being a part of the solution. The goal of this webinar series is to save lives in Dane County, to help set a standard for communities around the nation grappling with deaths from despair, to understand what underlines these deaths from despair from the perspective of people in pain, and to provide tools to help to all helpers who are working to prevent them. To lay the groundwork for the continued conversation and action on how to make Dane County's mental health and substance abuse disorder treatment system accessible, culturally competent, and effective at eliminating all deaths from despair. The first presentation of the series is entitled How to Save a Life, a suicide prevention training presented by Jean Papalia and Tom Duvall. Jean served as a city police officer for 26 years, working as a mental health liaison officer and a neighborhood officer, as well as a patrol officer. In retirement, she works as a suicide prevention trainer for Safe Communities, teaching QPR, suicide prevention. She also works part-time for the Wisconsin Department of Health Services as an abstract specialist on the violent death reporting system. Tom Duvall graduated from the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse in 2020 with 2 Bachelor of Science degrees, one for public health and community health education, and the other in psychology, with an emphasis on social behavior. Currently, Tom is the Injury Prevention Program Coordinator at Safe Communities. Tom enjoys bringing together key stakeholders to solve problems in the community. At Safe Communities, Tom works heavily in suicide prevention, as well as traffic and pedestrian safety. Thank you all for taking the time to learn with us today. Now, enjoy the webinar.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our suicide prevention training hosted by Safe Communities. I'm Tom Duvall, and with me is Jean Papalia. So I want to start off with a little background on what Safe Community does and why we are here today. Safe Community is a membership-based injury prevention coalition that strives to make the community a healthy and safer place for all individuals. Our mission at Safe Communities is to build partnerships with people and organizations to save lives, prevent injuries, and make our community safer. Safe Communities focuses on drug poisoning prevention, elderly falls prevention, traffic safety, pedestrian safety, and suicide prevention. We are a great resource for all these programs. However, today, we will primarily be focusing on suicide prevention.
Thank you for joining us. We're so glad you're here. But I want to make you aware that talking about suicide can be difficult. It can bring up painful feelings at times. Even things that we thought had been resolved may come up. So please take good care of yourself. Take a break if you need it. Do what works best for you. You'll see we have some resources on the screen. A warm line is a wonderful way to be able to talk to a peer about something that might be on your mind. We also have the 24/7 Journey Mental Health line and the Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which soon will become the number 988. Here are the objectives of our training today. We're going to address the myths and facts surrounding suicide. We feel this is important. Many of the myths surrounding suicide try to tell us to not take action, and suicide is something that requires action. We'll be talking about risk and protective factors, which you would think of sort of like a seesaw, that a risk factor can be mitigated by the work of a protective factor. We want to normalize the conversation around suicide. We'll talk about the differences between sympathy and empathy, but mostly we want you to feel empowered when talking to someone who might be struggling with intense suicidal feelings. And this program is a call to action.
So I'm going to start by telling you guys a story. And when I tell you this story, try to imagine yourself in this situation. You're walking along a river one day and you hear a plea for help from someone drowning. You're startled but energized as you dive into the water and save him. Using all your strength, you pull them to shore and start administering CPR. Your adrenaline is racing as they start to regain consciousness. Just as you're about to get back on your feet, another frantic call comes from the river. You can't believe it. You dive back into the river and pull out another person who also needs life-saving care. Now you're a bit frazzled, but still thrilled that you have saved 2 lives in one day. You mop the sweat off your brow, but when you turn around, another person is drowning in the river. One after another, you shout out to all the people around you for help. Now there are several people in the river with you, pulling drowning people out left and right. One of the rescuers swims out to the drowning group and tries to start teaching them how to tread water. This strategy helps some, but not all, because it turns out it's hard to learn how to tread water when you are drowning. Everyone looks at each other, completely overwhelmed, wondering when this will stop. Finally, you stand up and start running upstream. Another rescuer glares at you and shouts, "Where are you going? There are so many people drowning here. We need everyone here to help." To which you reply, "I'm going upstream to find out why all these people are falling into the river." Today, when we cover suicide prevention, we're going to cover multiple types. It has been shown that comprehensive and sustained efforts are the most important for effective suicide prevention. If we use multiple types of suicide prevention, we will achieve the best outcome when trying to reduce suicide rates. This comprehensive approach contains upstream, midstream, and downstream. Upstream tactics build protective factors that can mitigate risk, such as creating a sense of belonging, eliminating stigmatized language and discriminating actions, building resilience through life skills and mental hardiness, and enhance mental health literacy. Midstream approach is used to help identify people in emerging risk and link them to appropriate support before the issue develops into a suicidal crisis. Midstream strategies include screening for mental health conditions and suicide thoughts, promoting and normalizing many types of help-seeking and help-giving behavior, and training populations on how to have difficult suicide-specific conversations. Downstream tactics are needed to guide the response when suicide crisis has happened, including when people have acute thoughts of suicide, attempt suicide, or die by suicide. Current thinking about effective downstream tactics is not about involuntarily hospitalizations, putting people into restraints or isolating them from their community. The focus of downstream is, how can we approach this moment in a way that offers connection, dignity, and empowerment, and not fear or shame? This is a diagram of the stream parabola that I just broke down. As you can see, the upstream includes promoting resilience and inclusion. Midstream has normalizing help giving and reducing access to lethal means, connection to help. And finally, downstream is managing the crisis. Throughout this presentation, we will be going into each area and how to perform each one.
In the United States, we lose over 48,000 people to suicide each year. And while the leading causes of death are cancer and heart disease, and there are about 600,000 people a year, suicide is still a top 10 cause of death, and it's the number one cause of violent deaths. The numbers go up. Sometimes they go down a little bit, but in Wisconsin, the number stays at between 850 and 900 deaths a year. And in Dane County, we lose more than a person a week to suicide. So, what about deaths by overdose? Are they suicides or are they accidental deaths? An overdose death can be accidental or suicide. It's a judgment call made by the coroner or medical examiner who does the investigation. To be determined as suicide, there needs to be something that shows the person intended to die, like a note or perhaps comments made prior to death, or a toxicology which might show an extremely high dosage of a drug, or it may include a past attempt. If there isn't that indicator or proof of intent, it is normally listed as an accidental death. And I tell you that because I believe suicides are likely underreported. Suicide data can look different depending on where in the United States or the world someone is. Suicide deaths in Wisconsin are overwhelmingly men. 4 out of 5 suicides are men. So let's break down a myth here too. The myth is that mentally ill people are the only ones to die by suicide. And that's a strong myth, but research says at least half the people who died by suicide had a mental health crisis, which also means that half did not or were not diagnosed. We also see that 40% of the people were in treatment at the time of their death. Most suicides are related to a psychiatric disease, with depression and substance use disorders being the most relevant risk factors. However, anxiety, personality, eating, and trauma-related disorders may also contribute. The risk of suicide has been estimated to be 5 to 8% for several mental health disorders, such as depression, alcoholism, and schizophrenia. And as I said, people are in treatment. It's important to not treat everyone with a behavioral health disorder as an inevitable suicide. And it's important not to overlook risk factors that are common among all people, like an interpersonal relationship problem, financial problems, work problems, transition problems, things with works, jobs, homes, relationships. And here's another myth. Teens are the largest demographic to die by suicide. That's not true either. The largest demographic is working age men, 45 to 54. And the number 2 category would be that man group, ages 35 to 44. And here's one that may surprise you. The third group is men over the age of 85. Suicide risk expands across the lifespan. I want to share information from the Harvard School of Public Health program called Means Matters. Most efforts to prevent suicide focus on why people take their lives. But as we understand more about who attempts suicide and when and where and why, it becomes increasingly clear that how a person attempts, the means they use, plays a role in whether they live or die. As you can see, firearms account for half of all suicides. Firearms are highly lethal. So reducing a suicidal person's access to a highly lethal means, in this case a firearm, is an important part of a comprehensive approach to suicide prevention. It's based on the following understanding, such as the thing that many suicide attempts occur with little planning or during a short-term crisis. We also know that 90% of the people who attempt suicide and survive do not go on to die by suicide at a later date. And access to a firearm is a risk factor for suicide.
As Jean said, there's a great deal of focus on why someone dies by suicide, and that's worth knowing. But how, or the means used for the suicide, is a determinant of who lives or dies in a suicide attempt. Lethal means is defined as acknowledging that what a person uses as a tool for their suicide can make a big difference if they live or die. The most fatal way someone can attempt suicide is what would be most likely to kill a person would be firearms. Cutting, for example, is associated with a very, very low risk of death. It is an attempt, but the chances are less you will die from this attempt. If someone is thinking of killing themselves with a firearm and they can't access a firearm, they don't immediately think to make a substitution, like trying to hang themselves. In a journal article, it was best described this way. Persons have a preference for a given means, which would limit the possibility of substitution or displacement towards another method. It is also important to remember that a suicidal crisis is often short-lived, which suggests that if their preferred method isn't available, they would not put off their plan later or try something else. They just don't attempt suicide, which is a fantastic outcome. Putting time and space between a person in crisis and a lethal means of dying can save a life. The takeaway: keeping firearms away from someone in a crisis can save a life. People rarely substitute one means for another, and anything but a firearm will be less lethal, allowing for rescue or possibly a change of mind. If you tallied up all the fatalities of firearms in the state of Wisconsin, meaning all people who die by the use of a firearm, 71% are suicide deaths. That means nearly 3 out of 4 firearm deaths are a suicide. Safe Communities has started a program called the Safe Gun Storage Project, which other people in the state have adopted. This is a project where local gun shops who are identified will safely and temporarily store firearms if someone in the home is in crisis. The goal is safe, temporarily storage of firearms until the crisis passes. Safe Communities has partnered with 2 gun shops to provide safe gun storage, one being Max Creek Outfitters in Oregon, Wisconsin, and the other Mountain Man Guns in Cambridge, Wisconsin. You can contact either to ask about safe temporary storage. If it is not possible to get guns out of the house, use cable gun locks and remove ammunition from the house. You can also lock up all unloaded firearms in a hard-sided gun safe. Gun locks are available at healthcare facilities, safe communities, and local law enforcement agencies. Law enforcement can assist in unloading weapons and secure them with cable gun locks. Safe storage of medicine helps loved ones stay safe during a difficult time and is proven to save lives from overdoses. During a time of emotional hardship or major change in behavior, disposing of or locking up medicine until the situation improves may save a life. Take unwanted medicine to a med drop box. The locations are included on our websites, or contact Safe Communities directly or a pharmacy about locking medication up. Stigma about mental health, substance use disorder, tends to make us fear asking for help or even recognizing how many people are impacted. Think about what the world would look like if more people knew about the struggles people manage with. Let me play a 2-minute video for you breaking down stigma.
You know that feeling where your thoughts scare you or make life tough? Sometimes it feels like no one else in the world has those thoughts or feelings. No one seems to know how difficult it is to deal with your feelings. And it's not easy to share your deepest secrets. You might think something is wrong with you. Or you might worry what other people think. And all of that makes your thoughts and feelings worse. Our culture has created this environment of shame. Until the 1960s, society sent people away if they had challenges managing their thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Over time, we learned that we didn't have to be afraid. We learned how to help people get better. We became hopeful. But there are remnants of those images in our culture today, which is why some people still feel uncomfortable talking about it. The stigma has taken new forms too. With more access to more people all the time, it can seem like the world is telling us it's not okay to be anything but perfect. The truth is, everyone has thoughts or feelings that can be hard to deal with. So why do we make it so difficult on ourselves by judging others who could be going through the same challenges we are? What if, instead of seeing labels, we saw people who are struggling and could be there for them so they didn't feel so alone? What if we looked past our fear of mental health and started to talk about it in a constructive way? What if, as a society, we used empowering words and healthy images to help people feel supported? Maybe then more of us could feel comfortable telling others when we're having a hard time. Maybe more people would get the help they need. And maybe one day we won't have to talk separately about mental health and physical health, but just health. The truth is, each of us has the power to change our culture. Will you join us? Share this video with a kid, your neighbor, a friend, and help us break the stigma of mental health.
Stigma associated with self-harm, suicide, and mental health problems can cause people to find themselves in tough situations.
Let me start to repeat that distinction on mental illness and suicide. The majority of people who have a mental illness do not die by suicide. But some research has shown that up to 75 to 90% of the people who die from suicide have experienced a mental illness sometime in their life. But I want you to know that it's not just the mental illness. There are other factors or life circumstances, such as interpersonal relationship problems, substance abuse disorder, childhood trauma, a work, financial, or housing crisis that can bring on suicidal thinking. Let me introduce you to Dr. Thomas Joyner, who's a suicidologist out of Florida State University. Who even knew that was a job to be a suicidologist? But the suicide prevention world is grateful for the work done by Dr. Joyner and his extraordinary research and his theories about suicide. Dr. Joyner was a guest on a radio talk show, and a woman called in and she talked about her struggle with depression. She talked about how difficult it was for treatment and living with it. And Dr. Joyner said, these illnesses are exhausting. They're very grave. They're forces of nature, and they can cause all sorts of reactions, weariness, emotional pain, hopelessness, and on and on and on. So let me also share with you the words of someone distinctly different from a research psychologist. If you don't know who Tyson Fury is, he's the current world heavyweight boxing champion. He is considered one of the toughest guys on the planet. He's ruthless and has to be able to compete in the boxing world. However, not only has Tyson Fury been on the front lines of ending the stigma of mental health, he has also freely talked about his own struggles with it. So if Tyson Fury, one of the toughest guys in the world, can talk about mental health, it shows that we're all capable of normalizing the conversation. Both Dr. Joyner and Tyson Fury talk about the struggles of mental illness, but let's also be clear, these are highly treatable conditions which can be effectively managed. In 2005, Dr. Joyner published his work on suicide, and he called it an interpersonal theory of suicide. And he says that for a suicide to occur, which would be the middle of these three circles that overlap, three factors have to occur. So his interpersonal theory of suicide is a framework, and it does a good job of explaining the complex nature of suicide. So here are the three things that are occurring when a person is considering suicide. He says they have a perceived sense of burdensomeness. So this is a feeling that someone's existence is a burden to their family, to their friends, or to their community. They think wrongly, my death would be worth more than my life. And that is a fatal misrepresentation. A person could feel like a burden because of things like unemployment, medical or health problems, or incarceration. A person also has to have a thwarted sense of belonging, or they feel alienated. They feel they're not an integral part of a family or a circle or a work community or any other valued group. This person feels disconnected. Examples might be someone who is estranged from their family, perhaps due to gender identification, or someone who's even isolated geographically, because we know suicides are higher in rural areas. Or it can be people who are isolated by occupation. They work in a solitary place with little or no connection, or not much connection to the larger income of their work. It can be people who aren't in relationships or who have few or no social circles. So once again, this is about a lack of connection. But if those two risk factors are not enough, he says you also have to have a capability for suicide. And he said that's acquired largely through repeated exposure to painful or fearsome experiences. He says you have to develop a high level of pain and a sense of fearlessness in the face of death. So how does self-preservation, which is so powerful, become overrun? And he says it can be through repeated injuries, numerous physical fights, or certain occupations like physicians or first responders who often see death in graphic situations. It can be fire, EMT, frontline soldiers in which exposure to pain or injury happens to them, either directly or vicariously.
Many people think the presence of mental health disorder is the only or primary risk factor of suicide. It is easy to say depression, which is a great example, but as we discussed before, mental health only accounts for half of suicides. We want to start the conversation of what risk factors look that are based on everyday life. Risk factors are characteristics of a person, of their environment, that increases the likelihood that they may die by suicide. Risk factors don't allow us to predict suicide. I want to be very distinct here. No one can predict a suicide, but risk factors can be mitigated by protective factors, which we'll talk more about later. As you can see on here are a bunch of examples of risk factor. Some may be death of a loved one, death, especially by suicide, victim of a crime, arrest, drunken driving, feeling hopelessness, and entrapped. As you're reading these, you may think that you have actually experienced some of these risk factors because this is pretty common stuff. In fact, I'd say everyone has experienced something in one of these categories at some point in their life. We will talk about this a bit later, but it's worth remembering, as common as these risk factors are, a suicide death is an uncommon event. These risk factors are about change and transition. We can counter these risk factors with protective factors. Our connectedness to our social support group, like work, family, community, faith, can help us during these times of transition. Suicide is not just mental health or addiction challenges. Protective factors are personal or environmental characteristics that help protect people from suicide. Protective factors can also reside within the individual or a family, community, or other institutions. There are many ways to they make a very big difference on the influence exerted by risk factors. Protective factors are all the things we do or work on before a suicidal crisis. It is creating a life worth living and gaining the skills and resource to manage risk factors. Think of protective factors as some sort of armor. They help us shed off risk factors. I also want to get an example here. Let's use heart disease, for example. High blood pressure, high cholesterol, and smoking are all very high risk factors for heart disease. Now, on the other side, protective factors. How can we mitigate these risk factors? Some would say lower your blood pressure, stop smoking, managing your diet, or even exercise. As you can see here, some examples of protective factors. Some include safe storage of firearms, community-based policies to reduce alcohol and drug abuse, crisis intervention, and treatment options. Let me share with you one other important distinction about preventing suicide. It is not just about taking action in a crisis and recognizing risk factors. Suicide prevention is also about promoting protective factors. Like I said, there is no easy, quick fix for suicide. It needs attention in many, many areas. People at risk, the community at whole, and the structures and policies we have in place. Protective factors are what we can do at all times to keep people safe from suicide. It's kind of like a seatbelt. A seatbelt is something you wear at all times. You don't put your seatbelt on right before you crash because you never know when you will crash.
People in an emotional crisis often send out signs, or I call them red flags, but sometimes we don't see them. And it's not because, we're being blind to them, but sometimes people send out messages that are coded, or they're in a situation where we miss them. So warning signs are the downstream part of suicide prevention. It's when we need to take immediate action. So here are some signs you may see. Things people say: I'm going to kill myself. I can't go on. I'm looking for a way to end the pain. They may discuss feeling trapped, purposeless, hopeless. They sometimes experience signs of depression, problems with eating, sleeping, relationships. They can't concentrate. They may give away items or linger saying goodbye. They also might discuss feeling like they're a burden. So don't get all caught up in wondering if someone's really having, a warning sign or someone's truly at risk. It's more important that you stay with that person and be with them during this difficult time. Having a conversation with someone who's in crisis is not easy. But Dr. Brene Brown has this 3-minute video where she lays a strong foundation of how to begin a conversation.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
You can call yourself a gatekeeper, a bystander, or just a well-prepared person. But when you're able to put together the risk factors and then listen to what someone is saying, feel what they're experiencing, and think non-judgmentally about their life at this moment, you may find someone in crisis and you can take action. Gatekeepers are not therapists, which I think is great, but they also aren't part of the whole answer. Being a gatekeeper is just one small part in a whole river of care. So one of the things, though, as a gatekeeper or a bystander, is we want to fix them. Resist the urge to try to fix someone. You're not there to fix. You're there to listen. So let me also burst the final myth here. Here's the myth. Talking about suicide will put the idea into someone's head, and then they'll start thinking about it. The truth of the matter is, talking about suicide and asking them a question about it does not put the idea in their head, and it actually opens up a channel of communication. Asking someone if they are considering ending their life by suicide tells that person that you see their pain and you're ready and able to take on what many consider a difficult topic. Saying you're willing to listen to someone's story in a non-judgmental way, that you're not there to fix them, is how we start to build connection. I completely agree that hearing from someone you care about that they're in such a bad way that they're considering taking their life can be a gut punch. I can't think of a more difficult conversation to start. But there are ways to start that conversation. Open-ended questions. I hear you. I see your pain. I can get you help. Can I call someone? Can I sit with you? How are you feeling? How can I help you? Think about this phrase, emotional hospitality. That's basically what we're aiming for. And this isn't just talking to a friend in crisis. Emotional hospitality is a preventive factor. It's something we can do all the time. Hospitality for emotions means that your door is open, that you are trying to make people feel welcomed and comfortable. You're looking to put a person at ease, like the hospitality of offering a cold drink to a weary traveler. Emotional hospitality is meeting people's most basic need of connection. I think Brené Brown had it right. She said, I don't even know what to say, but I'm so glad you tell me. When you say that you have listened and validated, at that time is also when we can reach out for more help. This would be a time to ask if we could sit with someone while they talk to a therapist that they know. Perhaps they already have a person in their life that's been their soulmate. We can also call the suicide prevention line. We can call the Dane County crisis line. We could suggest calling the warm line and having them talk with that person. But stay with them. Continue that connection.
So now me and Jean are going to go through a mock situation. We're going to put everything we learned today into action. These mock situations are about working downstream. We'll be working in the crisis. And while not every crisis may be a pending suicide, this is a chance to see if our ears can now hear the risk factors or warning signs, and we feel like we can put the words together to start a conversation. Some of the things to keep in mind when you're going through these is ask about the suicide, practice active listening without judgment or panic, emotional hospitality, being direct, building trust, but at the same time, building collaboration. So here's the mock situation. You call your friend to chat. She lives with her father, and her mother recently died of cancer. Her boyfriend of 1 year just broke up with her because he doesn't want to feel attached right now. She has been doing well in her classes and has lots of friends. However, she tells you that she feels miserable. She adds that she's considering taking some of her father's prescription medication and says, "I just feel like I cannot take it anymore." So, Jean, what are some risk factors that you notice in this situation?
I guess the first one that jumps out to me is probably the sadness she's experiencing at the loss of her mother. And perhaps her father, who she lives with, is also experiencing that kind of grief. And at a time of great loss, she's now also lost her boyfriend. And when he specifically says he doesn't want to feel attached, that must have really struck her hard. I noticed that it says she's doing well in classes. You would think that someone with that kind of burden perhaps could, crumble in class or would show more signs in front of her friends. But this person seems to not do that. But you, as a friend, it seems, have tapped into something. She's laying it out there when she says she feels miserable, and she's broadcasting her means of suicide, which is she's considering taking her father's prescription medication. And I'm greatly worried about the "I can't take it anymore" aspect of the conversation.
What are some immediate things you can say to this person to help them?
I think I would go back to Brene Brown. I would probably be surprised and maybe say, "Oh, I don't really know quite what to say, but I'm so glad you shared that with me." And I think at some point I would say, "It sounds like you're considering suicide when you tell me you're thinking of taking prescription medications. Are you considering ending your life?" There's also just asking the open-ended questions. Can I come over? Can we talk a little bit more? Can we just go get some coffee right now? You just don't sound like you're doing well, and I want to be with you. To let them know how connected you feel to them at that time. I think I would also want to make sure that I continue to engage with this person and spend time with them, particularly if it's talking about some things that they just can't talk about with someone else. Like I said, maybe the grief they're feeling over the loss of a parent, perhaps the burden maybe they felt as a caregiver. Those are all things that a lot of people don't share, but they're experiencing.
And what are some actions you can take to help this person? I know you kind of touched on it a little bit.
I guess right away I'd also consider maybe trying to brainstorm a way to help with the prescription medications. I would love to be able to get a lockbox for the medications and be able to explain to my friend that I'm just concerned for her, but I know that her dad needs these medications, and I just want her to feel safe. I think I'd also try to work on a safety plan with her. Let her take an inventory of the people who are out there that could help her, particularly when it says she has lots of friends. Makes me think that she's got a group that could rally around her.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
So in this slide, it's kind of a little bit of a flow chart. It's a visual of what we've been talking about. So safeguarding the people in your life from the risk of suicide and supporting them. That's when we work on protective factors. And we also have to be people who can ask direct questions. I need help. I want to give help. I'm not feeling well. We want to embrace that in our families and our communities. We want to know steps we can do to keep people safe. We want to be present for people. We want to help them with that connection. And we want to follow up and let them know that our care continues on.
Before we leave today, I want to read you a quote about why we do suicide prevention. People who long for suicide typically want to escape unbearable torment they experience, deep emotional, physical pain, or malice, or fear, or trauma, or something else so powerful that it snuffs out the biological ingrained will to live. A society that tries to prevent suicide sends a message to people who suffer and to those who love them that their lives matter, that suicide is not the answer, that people care and can try to help, that things have a good chance of getting better.
Suicide prevention is really a story of living and of believing in the power to join people together. Even if it's in an imperfect way, we're at least together. Suicide prevention can also be about life promotion, which is helping people find a life worth living and one that's free from wants and free from pain. So one of the most powerful ways that we do life promotion is to elevate the voices of people who have lived experience with some of these risk factors. And by recognizing that their life story and their journey can be a roadmap for us, those with lived experience offer a foundation like no other. And I know that I'm grateful for the many people who've shared their story of life. Tom, I think this would be a good time that we could take some questions.
So the first question I have here is, do we know about the outcomes of COVID and suicide? Were there more suicides during COVID?
That's a really good question, and it involves some of the work that I've been doing with the state on collecting the data. Much of the data on suicides can take a while to gather because it involves investigations which often remain open for quite a bit of time. Some of the preliminary data shows us, however, that deaths actually declined during the pandemic or were at least level. And although there hasn't been complete study done on it, some of the theories are that during the great time of the pandemic, we actually joined together as a community or as a society because we were all facing that same crisis together. We also started talking about mental health, and maybe we offered a little more forgiveness to people. We understood the struggles people were going through with, working from home, sickness and loss of family members, working with children who were doing online school. And maybe we just, cut each other a little bit of slack during that time. And we definitely normalized the conversation about mental health. I found far more people asking the question, how are you doing? And then waiting for the answer afterwards. It will be interesting to see if any of these protective factors will continue beyond COVID.
Thank you for that answer. I do have another question right here. What happens if someone rejects your help?
What do you think about that? Have you had experiences with that?
I wouldn't say I exactly had any experiences, but I guess there's a lot of portions that go into it. I think one thing you can do with this is you kind of can embed your helping through other means. One way you can do this is just make plans with the individual to hang out. Maybe go bowling or a movie or coffee or almost anything like that. And you can think of it as in a way as if you make plans with this individual who is thinking about suicide, they may possibly put off their suicide because their schedule doesn't allow it, or that you hanging out with them gives them some sense of hope. And this is something too that you can build on. And just because you hang out with them doesn't mean you have to talk about their suicide feelings every time you're with them. Sometimes just being there is better for building connections than nothing at all, honestly. And then eventually, after you guys hang out a couple times, start inviting more. And then while you're doing this, you're building that protective factor. You're really building that support system that can help them through future crises. And like we said before, these crises are very short-lived. So if you happen to hang out with them a couple times a week for a few weeks, this crisis may be over very quickly.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that suicidal feelings can be quite intense, but that they usually, as high as they go, they sometimes will subside as well. And in what you're also saying reminds me that we need to start talking about what we can do every day to help with problem-solving skills. Seems to me many of the risk factors for suicide involve interpersonal skills, like the relationship part or working at a job or things that happen and asking for help if you're running behind on your rent or housing problems. So it would be, I always say, schools do a great job of telling you how to find the circumference of a circle, but I've never had a class about how to survive after the breakup of someone that I loved or the loss of someone very important. I would like to see more normalizing that kind of conversation and more skill building there.
Gene, I do have another question for you. Do you have a good idea how to help immigrants, refugees, etc., who don't have communities and friends yet, and English is not their first language?
Oh, I think you would have to find a way to understand their culture and work within the culture and offer opportunity. My grandparents did not speak English when they came to America. They lived in a very tight-knit community in a town where it wasn't necessary to speak English. They all spoke the same language together, and they each took on roles of helping each other out. We can be a welcoming community when we include them in what we do, and we don't force our culture on them, but rather embrace the mixing of the cultures. In ways we can help too would be with just everyday kindnesses. If it's shoveling the driveway, helping with rides, helping them to integrate into the new things that are happening in the community, perhaps building on communities they already have, if it's their faith community or a mother's group or other things that are already in place.
Perfect. Well, we want to thank this amazing panelists, Gene and Tom, for engaging with us for an hour on this serious matter. We are so grateful that we in Wisconsin, Safe Communities, is taking the lead, is taking the lead in the nation on this issue. And so we thank you for your time on today. We thank all of our audience for participating with us. And we look forward to you all continuing to join us in our series. This is going to be a series of conversations. So we want you to engage. Please tell your loved ones, your friends, your communities, tell them to join us for our next series on ending deaths from despair. Thank you so much for coming, and we look forward to seeing you again. Have a great day.